"I am the Christ, and I am also the devil." In the heart of Miami, thousands of kilometers away from Rome and Jerusalem, a religious cult leader emerged claiming that he was God incarnate, and that the number 666 was a sign of grace, not evil. He led thousands of followers, built an international media network, attacked churches, and died in silence, while his followers waited for his transformation into a glorified body. Who was this man? How did his movement come into existence? What drove thousands to believe in him? And was he merely a passing phenomenon, or a mirror of an age desperately searching for salvation in anything strange and unconventional? In this documentary, we open one of the most provocative religious files in contemporary history, the cult of Creciendo en Gracia, growing in grace. We tell the story as it unfolded, as it was documented, and as it ultimately collapsed. This is not just a story of faith, it is a story of charismatic power, media authority, and the fragility of belief when it is built upon the body of a single man. José Luis de Jesús Miranda was born on April 22, 1946, in the city of Ponce, on the island of Puerto Rico, which at the time was under United States control. He grew up in a poor environment within a conservative Catholic society, where the church represented the central institution in the lives of most local residents. From early childhood, José was described as a quiet and somewhat withdrawn child. According to some accounts, he displayed early religious inclinations and regularly attended church with his mother. There is no record that he received any formal theological education during his childhood. However, he was deeply influenced by the religious atmosphere surrounding him, particularly Christian imagery and symbolism. During his teenage years, he began to exhibit unusual tendencies related to the idea of divine selection. According to his own later testimony, he felt that he had a spiritual mission, even though the nature of that mission was not yet clear to him. Upon reaching adulthood, he emigrated to the United States, where the pivotal phase of his journey would begin. In the early 1970s, after spending several years living in Puerto Rico, José Luis de Jesús Miranda moved to the city of Miami, Florida, in the United States. He settled there at a time when the city was undergoing profound demographic and cultural transformations, driven by waves of immigration from Latin America. At that stage, José possessed no formal religious credentials and was not a known public figure. However, he gradually began to involve himself in small religious gatherings, becoming particularly influenced by the letters of St. Paul in the New Testament. He would later consider these writings to be the true doctrinal foundation of Christianity, in contrast to what he described as the distortions of traditional churches. In 1986, he announced the founding of a new religious group under the name Creciendo en Gracia, growing in grace. The movement began as a small organization promoting a new interpretation of Christianity centered on divine grace rather than religious law, and advocating the abandonment of traditional concepts of sin and punishment. Over time, José began to introduce increasingly unconventional religious interpretations. The most dramatic turning point came in 1998, when he publicly declared for the first time, during a broadcast, that he himself was the incarnate Christ, and that he represented the new embodiment of Jesus in the modern age. José did not stop at this claim. Instead, he continued to radically reshape religious concepts. He offered a highly personal interpretation of the Book of Revelation and asserted that he was the figure foretold by prophecy, not only as the return of Christ, but also as the Antichrist, though framed positively in his own words as one who abolishes the law and brings an end to the age of religion. By the end of the 1990s, José had fully stepped outside the boundaries of traditional Christianity. To his followers, he was no longer merely a reformer, but something far greater, a celestial being who spoke in the name of God and proclaimed the end of religions as they had been known. In his repeated speeches between 1999 and 2006, José emphasized that divine grace, following the crucifixion of Christ, had eliminated the need for repentance. He claimed that human beings had become righteous by nature, and that no actions, rituals, or religious practices were required to secure salvation. He argued that divine law, according to his interpretation, had been completely abolished after the crucifixion, and that the letters written by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament constituted the only correct doctrinal framework of Christianity. José explicitly rejected the concept of hell, describing it as a myth invented by the Catholic Church to frighten people and control them. He likewise dismissed prayer, fasting, repentance, and confession as merely human practices with no real connection to divine grace. One of the central pillars of his doctrine was his reinterpretation of the number 666, traditionally known in the Book of Revelation as the symbol of the beast of the end times, or the Antichrist. José offered a radically different reading of this number, claiming it to be the number of the perfected human being and a symbol of one who has fully grasped grace and been liberated from religion. He went so far as to openly declare that he himself was the bearer of this number. In 2006, he began publicly encouraging his followers to tattoo the number 666 on their bodies, presenting it as a mark of spiritual renewal and the identity of the true believer in the age of grace. Video footage later emerged showing dozens of people across Latin America and the United States tattooing 666, the number on their arms or necks during religious gatherings organized by his movement. In addition to this, José introduced a new concept of religious identity. He recognized no religious authority or biblical interpretation outside of his own, repeatedly asserting that his books and sermons were the ultimate source of divine understanding in this era. Through this discourse, he succeeded in attracting a wide segment of individuals disillusioned with traditional religious institutions, particularly young people, who found in his message a sense of total liberation from moral and religious constraints. In 2006, the cult Growing in Grace announced that its membership had reached approximately 100,000 followers, spread across more than 30 countries, primarily in Latin America and the United States, with a limited presence in Europe and Australia. The group's structure took the form of an interconnected network of branches known as ministries, each led by a local coordinator responsible for overseeing weekly meetings, media activities, and the organization of the cult's special rituals. The movement's main headquarters was located in Miami, Florida, where a large hall was established, adorned with images of José and banners displaying his doctrinal slogans, such as "Grace above the law" and "Christ is among us now." Within the group, loyalty to José was considered the primary criterion for belonging. He was not merely a leader or a spiritual guide, but rather the complete identity of the believer, as his followers described him. His followers referred to themselves as children of grace, and were distinguished by wearing shirts bearing the number 666, or the initials GDJ, which stood for Gobierno de Dios en Jesús, the government of God in Jesus. In 2002, José launched the first television broadcasting station owned by his cult, called Gracia, a Spanish-language religious channel broadcasting from Florida to all of Latin America via satellite. In the years that followed, he built a fully integrated media apparatus that included a television production department, a translation unit, editing teams, on-site filming crews covering group activities, as well as online platforms for live streaming over the internet, an approach that was relatively advanced for its time. By 2006, José's sermons were being broadcast weekly through more than 280 local television and radio stations across the United States, Venezuela, Colombia, Honduras, and other Latin American countries. During weekly rituals, his sermons were transmitted live from Miami to the movement's branches around the world. Attendees were instructed to stand the moment he appeared on screen, treating it as a divine presence rather than a mere human appearance. The group was characterized by a strict and disciplined internal structure, with a strong emphasis on personal loyalty to José. Any questioning of his teachings was regarded as apostasy and spiritual betrayal. By 2008, the movement had achieved significant representation in Venezuela, Colombia, Nicaragua, and the United States, and began establishing its own independent media channels. Over time, the group transformed from a missionary movement into a closed religious entity, built entirely around the centrality of José's persona, eliminating any external reference point, whether religious or intellectual. Since José Luis de Jesús Miranda publicly declared himself to be the incarnate Christ, tensions between his movement and traditional churches, most notably the Catholic Church, the most influential religious institution in Latin America, began to escalate sharply. The confrontation initially took a symbolic form, as José started openly criticizing core Christian doctrines such as repentance, confession, and the church sacraments. Over time, however, his rhetoric grew increasingly aggressive, evolving into direct attacks against the Catholic Church and its symbols, eventually amounting to an explicit declaration of hostility. In 2007, during a live broadcast from the group's headquarters in Miami, José described the Catholic Church as a dead religious system. He accused it of having invented hell to frighten people and of having distorted the message of grace brought by Christ. In his words, Pope Benedict XVI, who occupied the papal seat at the time, became a direct target of José's discourse. In one of his speeches, José stated, "He is an enemy of grace, not a representative of God on earth, but a representative of a history of restrictions and guilt." That same year, his movement called upon followers in several countries to destroy religious symbols, including crosses, statues, and images of saints, labeling them as worthless idols. Multiple incidents were documented during 2007 and 2008, particularly in Colombia and Honduras, where members of the group publicly tore down traditional images of Jesus in public squares and replaced them with images of José. These actions sparked waves of anger and protest from local churches. In Cali, Colombia, the Catholic Church issued a statement condemning the provocative acts that offend the feelings of believers, describing José's movement as a populist cult based on personality worship, promoting doctrinal chaos. In response to these criticisms, José continued to assert that he was incapable of error, claiming that he did not speak on his own behalf, but rather spoke as God. The leadership of the movement insisted that it did not promote violence, but instead sought to liberate minds from religious control. They claimed that the destruction of symbols was carried out symbolically, not with the intention of physical vandalism. As his rhetoric intensified, José increasingly portrayed himself as a direct adversary of traditional religious institutions. He claimed that his mission was to end the age of religion and build a new era of consciousness, repeatedly emphasizing that his message was not religious, but a spiritual revelation of what has been hidden for centuries. In late 2012, signs of change began to appear in José Luis de Jesús Miranda's public presence. After years of constant media visibility, he started to miss his weekly sermons more frequently, leaving his aides to deliver doctrinal messages in his place. At the beginning of 2013, internal reports within the movement circulated unofficial information about a deterioration in his health. Despite attempts at secrecy, news leaked that he was suffering from liver cancer and was undergoing treatment privately in the state of Florida. José never issued any direct public statement regarding his illness. His followers continued to insist that his absence was temporary, claiming that he was preparing to transition into a glorified body, a phrase drawn from his earlier sermons in which he spoke of a coming physical transformation reserved for true believers, according to his doctrine. However, on November 17, 2013, the movement officially announced his death at the age of 67. The The funeral was not broadcast, nor was the location of his burial publicly disclosed, which only fueled speculation and doubt among segments of his followers. In its obituary statement, the group described the event as the Great Transformation, asserting that he had not died, but passed into a higher spiritual level, and that he would return to rule as a visible God at the appropriate time. Several of his former aides were appointed to continue overseeing the movement's branches, though no direct successor was ever officially named. José's death marked a decisive turning point in the trajectory of the cult. The entire doctrinal and organizational structure of the movement had been built around his person, rather than around independent texts or transferable principles. As a result, his death led to fragmentation among followers and a clear decline in public activity. By 2015, many of the group's centers across Latin America had closed, and its central television channel, Gracia, ceased broadcasting. In some countries, such as Venezuela and Honduras, small groups of loyal followers remained, but they no longer possessed the mass momentum they once had at the height of the movement's influence. Meanwhile, a number of former followers began to question the doctrine as a whole. They had been waiting for a physical transformation or a heavenly return, but instead were confronted with an ordinary death, an undisclosed burial, and the absence of any tangible fulfillment of the movement's earlier promises. After José's death, the Growing in Grace movement entered a new phase marked by contraction and fragmentation. His personal presence had been the doctrinal and organizational axis of the group. With his absence, the central foundation of the message collapsed. The belief that Christ dwelled in a living body, physically present in Miami. By 2014, scattered attempts emerged by some of his former aides to reorganize the movement or claim continued representation of the so-called divine government. However, these efforts had no tangible impact on the ground, nor did any of them succeed in building a popular base comparable to what existed under José's leadership. At the same time, new figures appeared in parts of Latin America, attempting to appropriate the movement's symbols or adopt certain teachings, without explicitly recognizing José as a prophet or Christ. These efforts resulted in splinter groups, lacking coordination or a unified doctrinal direction. Meanwhile, a number of former followers began to appear in press and television interviews, recounting their experiences inside the movement. Some spoke of the hope the message had given them, while others described feelings of disappointment and disconnection from reality following José's death. Among scholars of comparative religion, José's movement has been classified as one of the most prominent charismatic religious movements to emerge in Latin America in recent decades. It is frequently cited as a case study in understanding personality cults and the construction of belief systems centered on a living leader rather than on textual or institutional authority. On a social level, the movement generated sharp polarization. Supporters viewed José as a pioneer in breaking the church's monopoly over religious authority, while critics regarded him as an exploitative figure who used charisma and deception to establish a closed cult. To this day, no scientific or legal evidence has surfaced indicating that the movement engaged in violence or directly violated the law. Nevertheless, it has remained controversial due to its anti-institutional rhetoric and its encouragement of social and religious separation. More than a decade after his death, José's movement remains a vivid example of how a single individual, through personal charisma, religious narrative, and technology, can reshape the convictions of thousands of people, even if only temporarily. And so the story comes to an end. The story of a man who began in Puerto Rico and ended as a dead god, sought by his followers among images, only to find him nowhere, except in an old voice that still says, "I am he, the Lord, and the devil, in a single body."